Richard Calloway glanced at my leave request for less than half a second. That was all it took. His expression tightened with open contempt before he even bothered to read my name. He flicked the paper onto the table like it offended him. "Vacation," he said, voice carrying easily across the room. Right now, A short. Amused breath escaped him. In the middle of earnings season, no one laughed out loud. They didn't need to. The message landed anyway. I was still standing, hands relaxed at my sides. The page lay face up between us, clean margins. Formal language, nothing emotional. I had prepared it carefully. Because when you work in risk, sloppiness isn't an option. Procedures exist for moments like this. Or at least, they're supposed to. Calloway leaned back, folding his arms like the discussion was already over. "This is what passes for leadership now," he continued, taking time off when things get uncomfortable. He looked around the table, eyes sharp, inviting agreement. "I don't see dedication here. I see someone making problems where there aren't any." A few heads nodded. Someone checked their phone. HR stared very intently at their notes. I didn't argue. I didn't explain why the request existed or what it protected. I didn't list the risks I had already flagged quietly over the years, so this company could keep pretending everything was fine. I said one sentence, evenly and clearly, because it was the only one that mattered. "I'm formally requesting leave under policy." For a brief second, the room went still. Then Calloway reached forward, grabbed the paper, and tore it straight down the center. The sound was sharp, deliberate. He tore it again, smaller pieces this time, and let them fall to the floor. "Don't log that," he said to HR without looking at them. "We're not doing this." And just like that, the meeting moved on. Forecasts, margins, confident voices pretending nothing had just happened. My job had never come with a corner office or applause. I was the Director of Risk Disclosure and Compliance Continuity, the role that exists to prevent damage before it becomes visible, useful when ignored, inconvenient when heard. Richard Calloway, as CEO, is the complete opposite, celebrated for bold decisions, praised for cutting through red tape. Years earlier, he had survived a near scandal by forcing through a policy overhaul and calling it transparency. As the discussion dragged on, my eyes dropped briefly to the torn paper near my shoes. I didn't bend down. I didn't pick it up. I left it where it was. If you're listening right now, I hope you're doing okay. Stay warm. Take care of yourself. Where are you listening from today if this story speaks to you? Consider subscribing, because what happened next changed everything. People rarely notice the work that prevents disasters. That was my specialty. For years, I lived inside documents no one wanted to read, crafting disclosures precise enough to satisfy regulators and dull enough to avoid panic. I rewrote language at midnight, stripped emotion from numbers, and flagged risks quietly before journalists ever smelled blood. When lawsuits never came, executives called it luck. They never called it me. I protected this company with emails. Long ones, careful ones, messages sent after meetings, after hallway comments, after someone decided to move fast and skip review. Those emails explained consequences without accusation. They sat unread in inboxes, archived by assistants, until a crisis passed and everyone congratulated themselves for navigating complexity. I watched credit accrue upward, while accountability dissolved downward. Richard Calloway hated compliance people. He didn't hide it, in his mind. We slowed momentum and bruised confidence. He believed markets rewarded boldness, not caution, and that procedure was a story you told regulators after success, not before it. Results mattered. Everything else was noise. He liked to say that out loud, usually smiling, usually while someone else took notes. I remembered one meeting in particular. Months before he laughed at my leave request. I had raised a material risk tied to reporting timelines. Nothing speculative, nothing dramatic. Just exposure that required disclosure if conditions shifted. I explained it once. Then again. Slower. Calloway cut me off with a raised hand and a practiced sigh. Legal will handle it, he said, already turning to the next slide. No one challenged him. No one asked me to finish. A few people stared at the table, suddenly fascinated by their pens. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, that mix of frustration and isolation that comes from being technically right and socially inconvenient. The meeting ended with optimism. My warning stayed behind, hovering without a home. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and pulled up our internal policy archive, not out of anger, out of habit. I searched by year, then by author. There it was, the transparency safeguard policy Richard himself had pushed through after a near scandal 3 years earlier. His signature sat neatly at the bottom. I opened it and started reading again. Line by line, as if it were new. It wasn't, but the weight of it felt different now. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated. I just noticed how carefully the language described obstruction, responsibility, and silence. I closed the file, knowing that this policy had never been symbolic. It was built for moments when someone decided to laugh instead of listen. The kind of moment that leaves marks the market can read, even when people pretend. 3 years earlier, the panic had come quietly, disguised as confidence. An analyst call had gone sideways. A reporter had asked the wrong question. And suddenly, a major investor wanted reassurances in writing. Richard Callaway reacted the way he always did when power felt threatened. He demanded structure. Immediately and loudly. Not because he believed in it, but because he needed something to point at. He called it the Transparency Safeguard Clause. I remembered the meeting clearly. He paced, spoke about accountability, and insisted the company needed proof that it took risks seriously. He wanted language strong enough to calm investors and flexible enough to stay out of his way. If we're clean, we should be able to show it, he said. The board nodded. Legal drafted. I reviewed every line. The clause itself was small, almost polite. It didn't accuse, it didn't threaten. It simply stated that if a designated officer holding material non-public risk information was obstructed from fulfilling disclosure obligations, mandatory disclosure procedures would initiate. No drama, no exceptions, just a mechanism. I was named directly in that clause, not because I asked to be, because I was already doing the work. I tracked exposure that didn't belong in presentations yet, but couldn't be ignored. I knew when silence crossed the line into liability. That was my role. Director of Risk Disclosure and Compliance Continuity. Uncelebrated, but precise. I explained the clause to Callaway when it was finalized. Not emotionally, not defensively. I walked him through the logic, step by step. I told him it existed to protect the company from itself. I told him it removed discretion during moments when judgment could be compromised. He nodded. Distracted. Checking messages. Fine, he said. As long as it doesn't slow us down. He never read it again. Policies age differently than people do. They don't forget. They don't reinterpret their intent to stay comfortable. They wait. This one waited while Callaway built his reputation on decisiveness and charm. It waited through earnings seasons and applause. It waited through meetings where caution was dismissed as weakness. When he tore my leave request apart, I didn't think about retaliation. I thought about definition. Obstruction wasn't an emotional concept. It was operational. It didn't require malice, only action, or refusal, or instruction. The clause didn't need me to trigger it. That was the part most people misunderstood. It wasn't a button. It was a condition. When certain facts aligned, the process moved forward on its own, routed through external compliance oversight built into our reporting framework. I had insisted on that architecture. Quietly, years ago, Callaway believed power came from choosing when rules applied. He believed transparency was a performance, but the clause he wanted removed that choice entirely. It assumed moments like this would happen, that someone would decide speed mattered more than obligation. I closed the policy document and leaned back in my chair. I felt nothing sharp. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. The mechanism was already in motion. indifferent to tone or intent. It would proceed exactly as written, exactly as signed. For the first time since the meeting, I understood something fully. The most dangerous systems aren't the ones designed to punish. They're the ones designed to operate without asking permission. And Richard Calloway had asked for this one himself. If you think this is just a familiar pattern, stay for one more minute. After the meeting, I did nothing. No follow-up, no clarification email, no appeal to HR. Silence wasn't confusion, it was compliance. I understood exactly what had happened, and I understood my role when procedure is violated. The cleanest response is restraint, not protest or noise under these conditions always. People assume silence means fear. In corporate systems, silence is documentation. Every skipped step leaves a trace. Every instruction not logged creates imbalance. I knew HR would avoid recording the incident, not out of malice, but habit. Avoid friction, defer conflict, keep meetings moving forward smoothly without written acknowledgement intentionally. By the end of the day, my request officially did not exist. HR hadn't entered it. No timestamp, no attachment, no reason code. That absence mattered. Our internal system treated unlogged interference as obstruction, a neutral term with serious consequences. It didn't judge intent. It measured deviation automatically, continuously, silently. I didn't monitor dashboards or check alerts. I trusted the framework. A third-party compliance vendor handled logging independently, exactly to prevent internal influence. Once the condition was met, their system recorded it, sealed it, and time-stamped the event. No human discretion, no conversations, no warnings issued. Quietly, automatically, that night. I went home without urgency. I made dinner. I fed the cat. Routine steadied my thoughts. Systems work best when emotions don't interfere. Panic invites mistakes. Calm allows processes to unfold precisely as designed, without contamination. I wasn't waiting for consequences. I was allowing inevitability to proceed naturally. Before bed, I opened one file, the policy archive. I searched by year, then author. The transparency safeguard clause appeared instantly. I saved a certified copy locally, including the signature page, not as leverage, as reference. In moments of dispute, accuracy outweighs memory every time, especially during institutional stress periods. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. There was nothing to explain. The clause existed whether I spoke or not. My involvement had already ended the moment obstruction occurred. From that point forward, the system required no participation from me. Silence wasn't passivity. It was completion by procedural definition. Calloway likely assumed the situation had ended. He thrived on finality, on visible wins. If nothing exploded immediately, he believed nothing would. That belief kept him comfortable. It also kept him blind. Processes don't announce themselves. They accumulate, align, and activate when thresholds are crossed according to predefined compliance logic. Sleep came easily. I wasn't anticipating a result. I was respecting sequence. Cause precedes effect. Always. The delay isn't mercy, it's mechanics. I had seen this pattern before. Slow and clinical. A flag. A review. A question forwarded beyond internal control toward external oversight. Reporting. Verification. Escalation. Review. Accountability. Exposure. Morning would come with its own momentum. Systems don't pause for reflection. They move when inputs satisfy conditions. Somewhere outside the building, a counter had started. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't tick audibly. It simply existed, counting compliance hours until mandatory sequence advanced without supervision. Emotion, commentary, intervention, discretion, reversal. Nothing about this felt like revenge. Revenge requires intent. This required patience. I hadn't designed the system to punish anyone. I had designed it to function when authority failed. That difference mattered. One is personal. The other is structural. Structures don't care who stands inside them or who collapses afterward. When people later asked why I stayed silent, I would say nothing. Silence had already spoken for me. It had been recorded, routed, and preserved. Somewhere between policy and process, momentum had shifted. The clock was running. No one heard it. That was the most dangerous part of systemic collapse. There are moments when restraint does more damage than force. This was one of them, by choosing calm over confrontation. I let the system reveal its full reach. The count had begun, impartial and irreversible, moving steadily forward, while everyone else believed the story had ended permanently, quietly, decisively, alone. The message reached Richard Calloway before it reached me, and that detail mattered more than anything he said afterward. It arrived quietly, wrapped in neutral language, the kind legal departments use when they already know the answer. We need clarification regarding an obstruction flag. No accusations, no urgency, just a question that assumed records existed. I learned about it later, indirectly, when my phone vibrated once on my desk and stopped. I didn't pick it up. I already understood the sequence. Legal inquiries never appear in isolation. They surface when documentation has settled into place and someone outside operational hierarchy has noticed a discrepancy worth preserving. Calloway, however, reacted exactly as expected. I wasn't in the room, but I could picture it perfectly. The tightening jaw, the clipped tone, the immediate need to assign blame to him. Obstruction wasn't a condition. It was an attitude problem, and I was the only name that fit comfortably inside that assumption. He said my name more than once, loudly. According to HR, he asked why I was creating problems again. He said compliance had become theatrical, that we were overreacting to nothing, that this company had survived worse without someone running to legal every time leadership made a decision. Then he ordered a review. That part interested me, not because it was aggressive, but because it was late. Reviews only work when systems are malleable. Logs, once sealed, don't bend. They don't negotiate. They don't forget. The external compliance vendor had already time-stamped the obstruction event, archived it, and locked access. Internal audits could look, but they couldn't touch. I stayed where I was. I didn't check my email. I didn't call anyone. Control isn't about intervention, it's about restraint. Every impulse to explain is an invitation to distort. I had learned that years earlier, watching executives talk themselves into trouble by filling silence with defensiveness. Calloway tried anyway. He demanded to know why legal was involved. He insisted there had been no obstruction, just a misunderstanding. He asked if something could be corrected retroactively. The answers were calm, professional, and useless to him. Records existed, processes had been followed, clarification would be documented, not debated. What he didn't know, what no one had told him yet, was that the email he was raging about hadn't gone only to him. Our framework required automatic transparency once an obstruction flag triggered legal review. The system copied the board compliance liaison by default. No discretion allowed. That copy mattered. The liaison wasn't operational. She didn't manage teams or attend earnings calls. Her role existed purely to observe governance integrity. When she was included, it meant the issue had moved beyond personality and into structure. Calloway couldn't outrank her function. No one could. I found out when the liaison's name appeared in the thread header the next morning. Still, I said nothing. Control doesn't require presence. It requires alignment. Everything was unfolding within expectation. Each step connected to the last by policy rather than emotion. Calloway would later claim he had been blindsided. He wasn't. He had signed the architecture that allowed this sequence to exist. He just never imagined it would apply to him. That assumption, more than any email, was the real obstruction. By the end of the day, his anger had nowhere to go. He couldn't undo the log. He couldn't isolate the inquiry. And he couldn't confront me without escalating visibility further. Pressure builds fastest when there's no obvious release. I remained quiet. Not out of fear, but discipline. The system was holding. The tension was contained. and for the first time since the meeting, I felt something settle into place. Not victory, stability, the kind that comes when control shifts away from volume and back to process, where it had always belonged. The structure was intact. And once intact, outcomes no longer required my participation at all. Everything you've heard so far is true, but it's not the whole truth. The report went live without ceremony, no announcement, no warning, no dramatic headline, just a regulatory disclosure released exactly as required, at exactly the time mandated by policy. I wasn't notified directly. I didn't need to be. Once a report like that is published, the market finds it faster than any human ever could. It didn't mention my name. It didn't describe personalities, tone, or intent. It didn't explain meetings or raised voices or torn paper. The language was spare, clinical, and devastating in its restraint. One line carried all the weight: governance obstruction involving designated risk officer. That was it. No adjectives, no conclusions, just a fact placed carefully where investors would see it. I watched the first reactions appear in silence. Analysts began asking questions they hadn't prepared. Traders paused, recalculated, hesitated. Algorithms flagged uncertainty and adjusted exposure. None of them cared who I was or what had happened in that room. They cared about governance risk, continuity, and trust. Markets don't punish emotion, they punish ambiguity. Inside the building, confusion spread faster than panic. Executives refreshed dashboards, looking for explanations that weren't there. Someone asked whether this was a mistake. Someone else asked how quickly it could be clarified. Calloway's voice cut through the noise, sharp and defensive. "This is being misread," he said. "It's procedural. It means nothing." No one repeated that sentence. The phones started ringing, not with outrage, but with questions. Can you confirm the scope? Is leadership continuity impacted? Was this preventable? Each question landed heavier than the last. Answers mattered now, and confidence alone wouldn't supply them. The report had done its job. It had introduced doubt without commentary. I stayed at my desk, hands folded. Listening to the building hum change pitch. The air felt tighter, charged. Screens glowed brighter. People moved faster, spoke quieter. Tension doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it creeps in through numbers and percentages, through silence between keystrokes. By midday, the stock had dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to trigger alerts. "Temporary fluctuation," someone muttered. Calloway ordered statements drafted, then revised, then delayed. Each revision added words but removed clarity. The market responded accordingly, shaving off confidence in increments too small to argue with and too consistent to ignore. "What's driving this?" a senior vice president asked out loud, frustration cracking through his composure. No one answered, because the answer wasn't a rumor or a leak or a hostile move. It was structural. A single line of disclosure had altered the risk profile, and the market was recalibrating in real time. I received one message, brief and professional, from a contact in compliance oversight. Disclosure acknowledged. Monitoring continues. That was all. No reassurance, no concern. Just confirmation that the process was unfolding as designed. As the afternoon wore on, the dip became a slide. Numbers turned red. Screens refreshed. Someone swore quietly. Calloway demanded to know why legal hadn't anticipated this reaction. Legal reminded him that the disclosure was mandatory, not optional, and that interpretation was beyond their control. He didn't like that answer. By closing bell, the stock was down enough to make headlines. Reporters still didn't know why. Analysts speculated. Commentators filled air with theories that missed the point entirely. No one yet understood what had been set in motion. I did. The market doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care about tone or authority or confidence. It cares about systems and signals. And it had just received one it couldn't ignore. The numbers kept moving, quietly, steadily, as if guided by a logic deeper than outrage, somewhere between disclosure and reaction. Momentum had shifted. The fall had begun before anyone realized they were already too late to explain it away. No emergency meeting could reverse that. No confident speech could erase it. The absence of detail was the detail. Investors sensed a governance fracture and adjusted accordingly. Step by step, transaction by transaction, long before leadership understood that explanation was no longer the problem, confidence had already been repriced. The silence spoke faster than any press release ever could. That day, by mid-morning, the number stopped being theoretical. 12% wasn't a dip, or a correction, or a nervous twitch. It was a message. Screens across the floor bled red while voices lowered, sharpened, and fractured. People who had been confident an hour earlier now spoke in careful fragments, afraid to commit to anything that might age badly before lunch. The trading halt never came, which made it worse. The stock kept sliding, clean and uninterrupted, each tick confirming that the market had made up its mind without asking permission. Analysts scrambled to reframe the narrative. But narratives don't slow numbers. 12% erased months of optimism in a single morning. And no one could point to a headline dramatic enough to justify it. Callaway called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited. That detail told me everything. When leaders believe presence equals influence, exclusion becomes instinctive. I heard about the meeting through the same channels that always leaked truth faster than official memos. Doors closed. Voices rose. Blame circled until it landed where it always did. This is being misinterpreted, Callaway insisted. According to someone who was there, there's no operational failure, no wrongdoing. He repeated the word misinterpretation, like it might harden into fact if spoken often enough. He asked legal to explain why a routine disclosure had caused panic. He asked finance to stabilize sentiment. He asked communications to prepare statements that said nothing while sounding certain. None of it worked. I stayed at my desk. Silence isn't absence, it's positioning. There was nothing I could add that would improve clarity. Any attempt to explain would invite argument. An argument would invite scrutiny. The report spoke for itself. My presence would only personalize what had already become systemic. Outside the room, tension thickened. Emails flew, then stalled. People refreshed stock charts obsessively, as if staring might reverse gravity. Someone joked weakly about buying the dip. No one laughed. 12% isn't a buying opportunity, it's a reassessment. By late morning, the questions changed. They stopped asking what had happened and started asking what it meant. That shift mattered. Meaning is where governance lives. It's where investors decide whether a company understands itself well enough to be trusted with capital. Right now, trust was draining away in measurable increments. I received no calls, no requests, no accusations. That was deliberate. Acknowledging me would have acknowledged relevance, and relevance would have reopened the original wound. Callaway preferred to treat the situation as external, abstract, detached from individual actions. He spoke about optics and timing, never structure or responsibility. Around noon, the board intervened. The request arrived quietly, routed through compliance oversight rather than leadership channels. It wasn't framed as a crisis response. It was framed as due diligence. The board wanted the original policy reviewed, not summaries, not interpretations, the policy itself, exactly as approved. That was the moment the satisfaction settled in. Cold and steady, not triumph, not relief, just alignment. This was how systems corrected themselves when personalities failed. No confrontation required, no raised voices. Just a return to first principles. The meeting inside continued, louder now, less focused. Callaway reportedly argued that revisiting old language would only create confusion. The board disagreed. Old language, they believed, created context. Context created accountability. I watched the stock stabilize. Briefly, then hover. 12% held. The number didn't bounce. It waited. Markets do that when they expect more information, when uncertainty has shifted from rumor to governance. I leaned back in my chair and finally exhaled, not because the damage was done, but because the direction was set. The board wasn't asking who was at fault. They were asking what had been signed and why it hadn't been respected. That distinction mattered. It meant this was no longer about explanation. It was about record. Somewhere upstairs, a document was being pulled from an archive, a signature was being rediscovered, and a story that had been dismissed as misinterpretation was about to become something far more difficult to escape. There would be no apology, only consequences unfolding with procedural clarity. I wasn't in the room when the document finally reached the table, but I knew the moment it happened. Justice has a particular rhythm. It moves slowly, then all at once, and when it arrives, it doesn't announce itself. It simply sits there, undeniable. The board meeting had been called under the label of policy review. No crisis language, no raised flags. That alone signaled the shift. When organizations stop debating symptoms and start rereading contracts, outcomes are no longer negotiable, according to the notes I later reviewed. The room was unusually quiet. No side conversations, no phones. The company's outside counsel entered last, carrying a slim folder instead of a binder. He didn't make eye contact with Richard Calloway. He walked straight to the center of the table and placed the document down with deliberate care. "This is the original policy," he said calmly. "The Transparency Safeguard Clause, adopted 3 years ago." No one interrupted him. He opened the folder, turned one page, then another, narrating nothing. Silence stretched. The sound of paper moving felt louder than any argument that had happened earlier that day. "Here," the lawyer continued, tapping the final page. "This is the executed version." The signature sat at the bottom, clean and unmistakable. Richard Calloway, Chief Executive Officer. No gasp followed, no denial. No one leaned forward. The truth didn't need reaction. It simply occupied space. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. Calloway himself said nothing. He didn't challenge the document. He didn't question its validity. He couldn't. This wasn't interpretation. It was authorship. The lawyer spoke again. "This clause defines obstruction as any action or instruction that prevents the designated officer from fulfilling mandatory disclosure obligations. It also specifies that once such obstruction occurs, disclosure proceeds automatically." A pause. There is no discretionary override. The phrase landed harder than any accusation could have. One of the board members finally asked, "Is there any mechanism to reverse or amend the process after the fact?" The lawyer didn't hesitate. "No. Once triggered, the sequence completes. There is no undo." That word undo hung in the air, absurd and small, like a question asked too late. I wasn't mentioned, not once. No one asked why I wasn't present. No one suggested calling me in. That, too, mattered. The process had moved beyond individuals. My absence wasn't an insult. It was confirmation that my role had already been fulfilled. Calloway's confidence, so carefully cultivated over years, had nowhere to attach itself. He had built his authority on decisiveness, on the belief that speed could outrun consequence. Now he was confronted with something he couldn't manage: charm or reframe. "This clause was intended as a safeguard," he said eventually, his voice measured, controlled, not a weapon. The lawyer met his gaze evenly. "Safeguards don't choose when to apply. They exist precisely for moments like this." No one argued. The board chair closed the folder slowly. "Then our focus needs to be governance response, not damage control," she said. "We need to address why this policy was ignored. Ignored. Not misunderstood. Not misapplied. Ignored." That distinction marked the end. When the meeting adjourned, nothing dramatic happened. No vote. No announcement. Just a shared understanding that the path forward had narrowed, and that accountability was no longer abstract. I learned about the meeting hours later. through a brief summary routed through compliance. I read it once, then closed the file. I didn't feel vindicated. Vindication implies conflict. This felt cleaner than that. The system had spoken in its own language, using the tools it was given by the very person now trapped inside it. Justice hadn't raised its voice. It had simply pointed to a signature and waited, and there was nothing left to undo. The tone changed before the decision did. That was how I knew Richard Calloway was running out of ground. When confidence collapses, it doesn't shatter all at once. It thins, becomes defensive, starts asking permission from people it once ignored. The boardroom hadn't turned against him yet, but it had stopped orbiting him, and for a man like Calloway, that was unbearable. I wasn't present, but I followed the sequence through transcripts and compliance summaries. They told the story cleanly enough. The discussion reopened not to debate policy, but to assign meaning to what had already been read. Calloway spoke first. He always did when silence threatened him. She should have explained better, he said, his voice tight, clipped. This never had to escalate. If she'd just been clearer about what she wanted, none of this would have happened. The statement hung there, naked and accusatory. It reframed the collapse as a communication failure, a misunderstanding caused by tone rather than authority. It was the last refuge of someone who could no longer deny facts and needed someone smaller to absorb the weight. Across the table, the outside counsel didn't react immediately. He flipped a page, adjusted his glasses, and then looked up. She did, he said calmly. You signed. The words landed with a finality that no follow-up could soften. Not shouted, not emphasized, just stated. Explanation had occurred. Consent had been given. The paper trail didn't care about hindsight. Calloway leaned forward. That clause wasn't meant to override leadership judgment. He snapped. It was there for optics, for reassurance. The lawyer shook his head once. Clauses don't function on intent. They function on language. And this language is explicit, a board member asked. Quietly. Are you saying this outcome was unavoidable? Yes, the lawyer replied. Once obstruction occurred, the process moved forward automatically. There was no discretionary pause, no exception for senior leadership. Calloway's jaw tightened. So I'm being punished for trusting my team, he asked. For making a call, no, the board chair said, her voice steady. You're being held accountable for disregarding a control you personally approved. That was when his resistance shifted from argument to survival. He spoke faster, sharper, grasping for leverage that no longer existed. He talked about market overreaction, about internal morale, about reputational damage caused by rigid frameworks. He warned that removing him would signal instability. He reminded them of past wins, past crises navigated, past loyalty. None of it moved the room. The board didn't interrupt him. They let him finish. That, too, mattered. When power fades, people stop rushing to stop you. Finally, the chair spoke again. Given the circumstances, the board is requesting that you temporarily step aside from operational duties while we assess governance exposure. The word temporarily was generous. Calloway heard only the rest. This is absurd, he said. You're sidelining me over a procedural technicality. It's not procedural, she replied. It's structural. Silence followed. Not awkward, conclusive. I read that line twice when it reached me later. Structural. That was the truth he couldn't outrun. Structures don't negotiate. They hold. The meeting adjourned without resolution beyond that request. No press release, no timeline, just a shift in authority, subtle but irreversible. An hour later, my phone rang. I didn't answer. I watched it vibrate itself still. Then came the message, sent through an assistant who had never contacted me before. Richard Calloway was requesting a meeting, private, urgent, his words, not hers. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. This, finally, was his last defense. Not policy, not argument, proximity. If he could speak to me directly, Perhaps he could rewrite the story into something personal, emotional, negotiable. I didn't respond. The request itself told me everything. He no longer believed the system could be bent. He believed only I could. That belief came too late. The meeting didn't happen in a boardroom. That was intentional. Richard Calloway asked for a private room on the executive floor, the kind reserved for delicate conversations that weren't meant to echo. No assistants, no lawyers, no witnesses, just 2 chairs, a glass table, and the illusion that proximity could still change outcomes. I arrived exactly on time. He was already there. For the first time since I'd known him, Calloway didn't stand when I entered. He didn't smile either. His posture was smaller, contained, like someone conserving energy after realizing force no longer worked. When he spoke, his voice was lower than I'd ever heard it. "Angela," he said, not sharp, not dismissive. "Careful. Thank you for coming." I didn't respond. I sat. He folded his hands, then unfolded them, then folded them again. "I wanted to clear the air," he said. Things escalated faster than anyone expected. Anyone, not him, not me, anyone. This never had to get this far. He continued. "There were misunderstandings, communication gaps. I think we can acknowledge that." I watched him closely. This wasn't anger. This was recalibration. He was testing a new approach, searching for leverage in tone instead of authority. "You've always been thorough," he said. "Methodical, sometimes too methodical. But that's not a flaw. It's just, context matters." I let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it. Calloway leaned forward slightly. "What happened in that meeting, tearing the paper that wasn't personal? It was a reaction. Pressure does that to people." He paused. "If you'd explained more clearly what you needed, I would have listened." That sentence was his final attempt to redirect responsibility without denying facts. He wanted acknowledgement, not forgiveness. Just enough agreement to soften the record. I spoke once. "I followed the policy you wrote." The words landed cleanly. No emphasis, no explanation, just a statement of sequence. Calloway blinked. He hadn't expected that. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That policy wasn't designed for this," he said. "It was meant as a safeguard, not a trigger." "It functioned as written," I replied. His jaw tightened. "So that's it. No flexibility, no discussion. There's nothing to discuss." He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through restraint. "You understand what's at stake here," he said. "The company, people's jobs, investor confidence." "I understand obligations," I said. "Those come first." For a moment, he looked almost angry again. Then something else replaced it. Calculation. "What do you want?" he asked. A public statement. "A role change, a settlement." I shook my head. "I don't want anything." "That's not realistic," he snapped. Then caught himself, lowered his voice again. "Everyone wants something." "I wanted compliance," I said. "That already happened." The room went quiet, not awkward, final. Calloway leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for an alternative narrative hidden in the lighting. When he looked at me again, the confidence was gone. "If this proceeds the way it's going," he said slowly, "there will be consequences." "Yes." I agreed. "There already are." He stared at me, trying to find regret. He didn't. "What happens now?" he asked. I reached into my bag and placed an envelope on the table between us. He looked down at it, confused. "What's that? My resignation," I said. His head snapped up. "You're quitting, yes." The word settled heavier than anything else I'd said. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "You're in the middle of this. Walking away now undermines your position. It completes it," I replied. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You think leaving absolves you of responsibility? No," I said. "It removes me from leverage." Calloway stared at the envelope as if it might move on its own. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You could have power here." "I never needed power," I said. "I needed structure." I stood. He didn't. As I walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. There was no negotiation because none was required. The system didn't need me anymore. It had already absorbed everything necessary. Behind me, Richard Calloway sat alone with a document he couldn't undo, in a room where volume no longer mattered. The collapse didn't arrive with shouting or sirens. It arrived through questions, the kind that don't stop once they start. By the next morning, journalists were no longer speculating about market nerves or temporary volatility. They were tracing process, authority, and accountability, and they were doing it with uncomfortable precision. I read the first article over coffee. It quoted anonymous sources, cited governance experts, and used phrases like structural breakdown and internal controls ignored. My name wasn't mentioned. That omission was intentional. The story wasn't about a person. It was about a system that had been overridden and the consequences that followed. More articles appeared by noon. Reporters requested timelines, policies, and confirmation of oversight mechanisms. The questions grew sharper. Who had disclosure authority? Why was it obstructed? What safeguards failed? Each answer pointed back to the same place, a decision that had seemed small when it was made. Investors noticed. They always do when narratives shift from performance to trust. Calls flooded the board. Not angry, but firm. We need assurance this won't happen again. Leadership credibility is compromised. What corrective actions are being taken? Those were not questions you could smooth over with confidence. By midweek, the demand was explicit. Several major funds issued statements requesting leadership change. One was blunt governance failures, require governance consequences. Another said, "This is not about intent, it's about structure." I read that line twice. It sounded familiar. Calloway tried to hold the line. He gave a statement, calling the situation regrettable and mischaracterized. He emphasized growth metrics and long-term vision. The market didn't respond. Neither did the board. Once investors decide leadership is the risk, no amount of reassurance can reverse that perception. The announcement came quietly. Richard Calloway would be stepping down, effective immediately. The release thanked him for his service and cited strategic realignment. It didn't mention obstruction or policy. It didn't have to. Everyone already knew. I felt no rush of satisfaction reading it, just recognition. Consequences had finished assembling themselves. This was the last piece clicking into place. The aftershocks continued. Analysts revised outlooks. Internal audits expanded. Policies were reviewed publicly this time, not buried in appendices. The company began rebuilding trust the only way it could, slowly, visibly, and without shortcuts. A week later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The caller introduced herself as a partner at an advisory firm specializing in governance remediation. "We'd like to talk," she said. Your name came up repeatedly. The offer was formal, generous, and precise. Independent governance advisor, external oversight, clear boundaries, real authority. It was the kind of role created after failure. When organizations finally understand what they need. Others followed. Boards, funds, institutions that had watched the fallout and decided they wanted prevention, not cleanup. Each conversation was calm, professional, respectful. No one asked me to explain what happened. They already understood. One invitation came from the company itself, a carefully worded message proposing a return, framed as reconciliation. Your experience would be invaluable. It read, "We'd like to explore a path forward." I declined, not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly. Returning would have turned resolution into theater. I had already completed my role. Going back would have blurred the lesson when asked why. I gave the same answer every time. The system worked once it was allowed to. That's enough. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was instructive. Careers adjusted, language changed. People remembered that signatures mattered, that silence could be evidence, and that structure always outlasted personality. I moved on without fanfare, carrying no bitterness. The story didn't end with revenge. It ended with correction. That felt right. The first morning in my new role felt ordinary in the best possible way. No security badge drama, no whispered side glances, just a clean desk, a legal pad, and a calendar filled with conversations about structure instead of personalities. I wasn't there to fix people. I was there to strengthen systems. And that distinction brought a calm I hadn't realized I was missing. My title was Independent Governance Advisor, external, detached, precise. I answered to boards, not executives, and my responsibility was narrow by design. I reviewed frameworks, escalation paths, disclosure controls. I asked questions that didn't accuse and documented answers that didn't bend. It was quiet work, effective work, the kind that rarely makes headlines because it prevents them. People occasionally hinted at what had happened before. A pause in conversation, a careful phrase. I never corrected them and never added detail. I didn't need to. The record already existed, sealed and referenced. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was closure. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, no desire to revisit the past. What I felt instead was alignment. Events had unfolded according to structure, not spite. No one had been ambushed. No rule had been invented retroactively. The outcome was the result of choices meeting consequences without interference. From time to time, someone asked why I hadn't spoken publicly, why I hadn't told my side. The question always assumed that justice required narration. I disagreed. Speaking would have personalized what needed to remain systemic. The moment words enter, motives get questioned. Systems don't have motives. They only have design. I learned something valuable watching the aftermath from a distance. When institutions fail, they often look for villains. When they recover, they look for processes. That shift is subtle but permanent. It changes how decisions are made long after the story fades. The company I left rebuilt itself slowly. New leadership, revised controls, more transparency. This time practiced instead of promised. I didn't watch closely. I didn't need to. My role was never to oversee their redemption, only to ensure the lesson had a place to land. In my quieter moments, I thought about that meeting, the torn paper, the laughter. It no longer stung. It had become context, not wound. Power, I realized, isn't volume or authority. It's continuity. It's what remains intact when emotion burns itself out. I never sought revenge. I never issued statements. I let the system speak because it already knew the language required. And when people ask what I learned, I tell them this, simply and without emphasis. You don't lose power when someone tears your paper. You lose it when you forget what you signed. I didn't win by raising my voice. I didn't win by humiliating anyone in public or by proving I was smarter. What stayed with me, long after everything settled, was something quieter and heavier. I learned that dignity isn't about how hard you fight in the moment. It's about how carefully you build your ground before the moment ever arrives. For years, I thought being unseen meant being weak, that if no one praised the work, it didn't count. But standing inside that system, watching it respond exactly as designed, I understood something different. Real strength is often invisible until pressure arrives, and when it does, it's too late to fake it. Procedures remember, signatures remember. Silence, when chosen deliberately, remembers too. Emotionally, the hardest part wasn't being mocked. It was staying calm while being underestimated. That restraint hurt more than anger ever could. Yet it also protected something essential, my sense of self. I didn't need revenge to feel whole. I needed alignment. I needed to know that doing the right thing, even quietly, still mattered. If you're listening right now, I wonder, are you still here with me to the end of this story? And if you are, maybe it's because some part of it feels familiar. Maybe you've been the one who held things together without credit. Maybe you've been dismissed for caring about details that others ignored. I'd really like to hear your story. Where are you listening from today? What moment in your own life made you realize that integrity isn't loud, but it lasts? If this resonated with you, consider leaving a comment. Share it with someone who might need it. A like helps more than you know. And if you want to stay with me for more stories like this, quietly grounded but deeply human, I'd be honored if you subscribed.